about John F. Kennedy and the Cold War. So the Kennedy administration faced some of the most dangerous confrontations with the Soviets in American history. And so this first clip I want to use just to illustrate, it's a clip from a movie called 13 Days, made about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this just illustrates what nuclear war could look like. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but they're basically drone space shuttles. They operate remotely. They go up into the orbit. They break apart, and the nuclear warheads drop down and can hit anywhere on the planet. So these are long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles. So a country that has this power can destroy any place in the world from anywhere in the world. The Soviets had enough of these weapons to wipe out all major U.S. population centers within a half-hour radius. Like, within an hour, every U.S. city would be dead. And our only recourse was the fact that we could do the same to them. It was all we could do. We had enough of a window where we knew it was coming and we could respond in kind. So this is footage from a U-2 spy plane. Those are those, big fancy planes that can fly way up almost in outer space. They can fly above the radar. In October of 1962, a pilot of one of these planes flew over Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of the United States. They have cameras at the bottom. So his mission was to photograph potential missile silos in Cuba. These are some of the actual photographs. And so I wanted to pause on the photographs themselves. If you look at the top right of the frame there, those are missile silos. They contain nuclear warheads 90 miles off the coast. So you don't even have to have an intercontinental ballistic missile. Limited range missiles can be fired from these installations and can hit targets in the United States within an even shorter window. So that's the situation that we were in the 1960s. The Soviets launched the first artificial satellite into space with Sputnik. And the Soviets had the larger conventional military forces. And one of the chief concerns in the 1960 presidential election was that we were falling behind the Soviets. And so the two chief candidates in this election were John F. Kennedy, the Democratic candidate, facing Richard Nixon. Of course, most of what you know about Nixon is related to Watergate, and we'll talk about that later in the course. But for right now, all you need to know is that Richard Nixon is a foreign policy expert. Comparing him and Kennedy is not fair. Nixon knew far more about the situation than John F. Kennedy did. But here's the difference. The 1960 presidential election featured the very first televised public debates. And of course, in these televised public debates, candidates were watching and were being seen by all Americans. And Americans were not just hearing the responses or reading about the responses. They were watching these candidates answer questions. Now, Kennedy comes from a very wealthy family. Joseph Kennedy, invested wisely during the Great Depression, bought a huge number of stocks when they hit rock bottom, rode the Depression out, and became an absolutely powerful person. And of course, the Kennedy family has a legacy of power in the United States. So John F. Kennedy comes from wealth. And he had TV producers to coach him of how to appear on these televised debates. And so even though, if you watch the debates, Nixon crushed him, just absolutely crushed him. But it felt like Kennedy won because he was better looking, he smiled, he entertained the crowd, he told little jokes. He didn't know as much about the topics, but again, he played the cameras a lot better. Kennedy also made a clever stance when he associated himself with the civil rights movement. He went to visit Dr. Martin Luther King, who was in jail in Birmingham for registering African Americans to vote. And during his campaign, he went to visit and sit with Dr. King in jail. Again, associating himself with the civil rights movement. So what began with Truman and continued with Democratic candidates, now Kennedy is continuing that legacy. And so Kennedy won. It was still a close election. I mean, there were plenty of people who saw through facade and understood that Nixon maybe knew more about this. But Kennedy's campaign represented hope to a lot of people. He again, associated himself with these important social causes. He had style to him. I mean, he had his wife was one of the most beautiful women in the country. He was one of the most handsome candidates in American history. And that counts for something in a nationwide popularity contest. And so there's glamour to the White House and elegance. But yes, many people criticized this and said that the style lacks substance. But we're going to see him put to the test in a number of situations. He did pick some very capable people to be his advisors in his cabinet. His brother, Robert Kennedy, who would later run for president in 1968, was chosen as Attorney General. Robert McNamara was his Secretary of Defense. He's got a lot of very capable people here advising him.
In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. Finally, whether you are citizens of America or citizens of the world, ask of us here the same high standards of strength and sacrifice which we ask of you. With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love asking His blessing and His help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own.
So, I love Kennedy's inaugural address, and I want to point out a few of the classic points from it. First off, of course, he says, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. But then he takes it a step further, and he says, my fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America can do for you, but what we together can do to make the world a better place. And he goes on to say, and what's the reward? It's a good conscience. It's the right thing to do, to seek to serve others, to help, to leave the world a better place. And in regards to, since foreign policy, of course, is one of the key issues in this campaign, then we've got to think about what can be done. If nuclear war is the extreme, and we obviously want to avoid that, but we still want to contain the threat of communism, how do we continue to be players on the world stage without resorting to nuclear weapons? Well, this is where he came up with his flexible response strategy. That we needed to be able to fight limited engagements. And so he increased defense spending in three key areas. Number one, strengthened our conventional forces. We need to be able to fight limited engagements in traditional ways without having to resort to intercontinental ballistic missiles. He also created a special new branch of the Army, the Green Berets, or the Special Forces. It was the purpose of the Green Berets from their origin to go to smaller places fighting against communist movements, to train these indigenous peoples to fight, to equip them, to arm them, and to function as military advisors around the world. And so this allows us to be engaged in hundreds of different countries in a very limited way. But then also, yes, under Kennedy's administration, we tripled the number of nuclear weapons that we possessed. And so let's not kid ourselves into thinking that this is going to avoid nuclear war forever. On to Cuba. Fidel Castro led a communist uprising in Cuba in the 1950s. And he went on to seize all U.S. properties there, to claim the lands of Cuba, to throw off the Platt Amendment. Remember the U.S.'s addendum to the Cuban Constitution after the Spanish-American War, that we maintained the right to purchase land, that Cuba could not ask any other country for assistance, and in response to Cuba's turn toward communism, we cut them off. We broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba. We said no one can go to Cuba. No one should have business with Cuba. Americans stay away, period. Cubans left the country in exile. About 10% of their population came, and many of them landed and moved to Miami. So most of these came to the United States. And in fact, of these Cuban exiles, the Central Intelligence Agency began to work with these exiles in secret and to train them for a counter invasion. It was meant to look like an internal civil war. The combatants were to be these Cuban exiles, and so it was supposed to be Cubans versus Cubans. It was called the Bay of Pigs invasion. It went horribly wrong. Someone told Castro these people were coming. And it wasn't just Cuban exiles. In fact, it was American Special Forces operatives that also landed on the beaches of Cuba. And they were taken prisoner. And they were put on television for the world to see that now we have attacked Cuba. We have started a war.
This offensive buildup.
Three people, a president, a revolutionary, and a reporter. For a moment, they seemed to hold the fate of the world in their hands. These three came together in the shadow of a terrible possibility. Cuba stood ready to become the flashpoint for World War III. Fidel Castro, Cuba's leader, was a symbol of everything the United States feared. American President John F. Kennedy publicly denounced Castro and plotted to topple him. But newly uncovered documents reveal that Kennedy and Castro were secretly reaching out to each other. And the catalyst was Lisa Howard, a pioneering journalist, all but forgotten today. Only now has this secret history been revealed, and Lisa Howard had begun to claim her legacy.
We will carry the fight to the people in the fall, and we shall win.
After winning the 1960 Democratic nomination, presidential candidate John F. Kennedy discovered that the American public was deeply concerned about Cuba.
ABC News saying good evening from New York, where the two major candidates for President of the United States are about to engage in their...
Kennedy used the Cuba issue to attack his opponent, Richard Nixon.
Castro is only the beginning of our difficulties throughout Latin America. The big struggle will be to prevent the influence of Castro spreading to other countries. Mexico, Panama, Brazil.
Kennedy's strategy worked. In January 1961, he assumed the presidency. In his inaugural address, he vowed to keep the Americans free of Soviet influence.
Let all our neighbors know that we shall join with them to oppose aggression or subversion anywhere in the Americas. And let every other power know that this hemisphere intends to remain the master of its own house.
But what the American public didn't know was that Kennedy had also inherited the outgoing president's solution to the problem of Cuba. In secret camps, the CIA was training Cuban exiles for an invasion of the island. Just a few months later, the invasion began. The landing at the Bay of Pigs was meant to be a surprise, but Castro knew it was coming. The CIA expected the Cubans to rise in support of their exiled liberators. Instead, they fought back the invasion. Castro personally directed the defense of the island. The United States refused to acknowledge involvement with the invasion publicly, a policy that left the invaders stranded.
The rebels did, of course, get in trouble on the beach. They were on the verge of being wiped out. There was U.S. naval aircraft within range of that beach. The chiefs and the CIA pleaded for the president to allow the use of that aircraft. And he said, no, I'm not going to initiate a war with Cuba.
The battle was soon over. 114 invaders were killed, and more than 1,000 were taken prisoner. When questioned, Kennedy could not admit what the press already knew: the United States' involvement with the invasion. He looked weak and confused.
Not to conceal responsibility because I'm the responsible officer of the government, but merely because and that is quite obvious, but merely because I do not believe that such a discussion would benefit us during the present difficult situation.
So this brings up the Cuban Missile Crisis. So in response to the Bay of Pigs, Castro reached out to Nikita Khrushchev, premier of the Soviet Union, and asked for aid and supplies and even weapons. And so the Soviet Union responded. And Khrushchev sent weapons, including nuclear missiles, to Cuba. And the president went public with this information. when that U-2 spy plane took those photographs showing those missile silos with the nuclear capacity to destroy the United States. And Kennedy went on television and warned the American people of a nuclear attack, and warned the Soviets that use of these nuclear weapons would trigger a war with the Soviet Union. And this is the closest we've ever come to a nuclear war. He imposed a blockade on the island of Cuba. The United States Navy surrounded the entire island. No ships were to get in, no ships were to get out. Any aircraft attempting to fly over would be shot down. Any ships or submarines attempting to break the blockade would be fired upon. And in this next scene, I want to show you how close we came to nuclear war. All right, so you saw how close that was. I mean, it's ridiculous. In fact, they later interviewed the captain of the Soviet sub, and he said he had very strict orders that if he were fired upon, to launch his nuclear warheads. So the sub did contain nuclear warheads, and they were to be used if those depth charges had been dropped. Now, Khrushchev was criticized for backing down. Kennedy was criticized for playing this way too close. However, we didn't find out until later, much later in fact, that both parties were in constant communication. In fact, there were deals being brokered behind closed doors. So Khrushchev removed the nuclear warheads from Cuba, removing the immediate threat of instant strikes on the United States. In exchange, we removed nuclear warheads from Turkey, which if you look at a map, Turkey shares a border with the Soviet Union. It would have given us first strike capabilities as well. So both sides were criticized. Thankfully, this is the closest we ever came to direct nuclear war. But obviously the Cold War is not over. Now let's go over to the city of Berlin. Berlin is controlled by 4 different parties. The Soviets controlled the East, and the West was controlled by the United States, Great Britain, and France. West Berlin was thriving economically, while East Berlin was languishing. And many people were fleeing the eastern part of the city and going over to live in the West. Well, to complicate things further, the city of Berlin is within East Germany. And so it's surrounded by territories that are controlled directly by the Soviet Union. And the fact that people are leaving East Berlin was embarrassing to the Soviets. And so the Berlin Wall was built around the city of East Berlin, isolating the West and the East. Of course, this became a symbol of the enduring Cold War. And one of the very first actions at the end of the Cold War was the tearing down of this wall. And you can go to D.C. and you can actually see the wall today. It's in a museum. Now, Khrushchev and Kennedy were very aware of the potential danger of any hot-headed decisions. And the Cuban Missile Crisis emphasized the importance of communication between the two parties. And so a hotline, a direct telephone line of communication was established between the White House and the Kremlin. And also both parties agreed to a limited test ban treaty. And that means that neither side would test nuclear weapons in the atmosphere.